Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are watching us from. We are live on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Twitter X. If you are watching today, we are coming to you live from Sydney, Australia, and we are lucky to be counted among the living today because it's not everybody who got up today is here up to this day. So we just want to give a shout out to everybody who is watching this moment. We just want to honor you for your presence, and also today we are going to talk about the impact of loss and grief on humanity. Who feels it more? To join me to break down this question and come out with some solution and answers to this is one and only Petra Page and Wilfred Roach. Lady and gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Victoria. Hi.
Thank you, Victoria.
Hello, hello. The question today is who feels it more, the impact of loss and grief. When we talk about loss and grief, we are talking about different areas of life where we lose something or something valuable is missing in our lives, and we want to find a way of dealing with it. And as a result, we want to have a look at how much of that impact have on every individual, society, or a group of people, be it the family or individuals. How do we actually go about this in terms of how we feel it? I put up a poll just recently, and 80% of the respondents says that men feel the impact of loss and grief more, and 20% says women. So I want us to delve a little bit into that today. So the first question literally is, who feels it more in your view? Petra, you can go first.
Oh, thank you. I think that women are better at expressing it. They tend to be more prepared to be vulnerable. Very often, this is the subject of conversations is, the sadness that they feel about different things. Whereas men will very often be more stoic and hold it within and not really want to share it with their mates. I know that sounds like a very sexist thing, but the statistics do bear that out. That in fact, it's men who commit suicide over loss and grief more than women do because they have nowhere to unpack it, no one to unpack it with. They don't feel able to do it. It affects them in a particular way, often in terms of their sense of responsibility for their families and so on. And they just find it very hard to seem weak as they might see it. And that could also be a cultural imposition. But the reality is that they suffer, and they suffer alone, whereas women will very often suffer in company.
Wow, that is loaded over there. We're going to unpack that a little bit. Someone once says that women talk through their pain and losses and griefs. They talk through it, whilst the men think through it. Will you agree that that is got something to do with culture and how we were brought up, and how we deal with this sort of thing, be it from a man's perspective because of the way we were brought up? Does our upbringing have an impact on how we deal with loss and grief?
Well, certainly, it's a sort of perennial question, but I think that there is much truth in it. I mean, I think if I think of or reflect on my own personal experiences as a boy, I mean, I grew up in a different era, but I think that still holds up to a point today that any showing of emotion was not really acceptable, and that could have been to do with the fact that we were from my family, my immediate family, my parents were from a migrant background and growing up in a really difficult environment in London in the UK. But more generally, certainly there is empirical evidence, as Petra has said, in terms of the suffering in silence of men. I spent many years working on a crisis and suicide prevention helpline, and most of the men, it would be fair to say, across generations, I mean, I couldn't see them, but in terms of, because it was a telephone helpline, but in terms of conversation, men in a way found it a relief to actually share their emotions. You know, ironically, they couldn't be seen, but to actually start to break down the sort of gender-specific restrictions that they had imposed on themselves or had continued because they thought that that's what men are supposed to, how they're supposed to react. And certainly the statistics, the national statistics, are quite horrifying, at least in Australia. And I have a vague recollection that this is a worldwide thing. That 75% of successfully completed suicides are men, and the other 25% are women. And if you think that the last figures, and I'm going by memory, were over 3,000 people who successfully ended their lives, that's a couple of thousand men over a given period that the statistics are being collected. It's horrifying.
It really is.
I just want to say, if you are watching us for the first time, or you've been following us for the last few minutes, we've been talking about the impact of loss and grief on humanity and who feels it more. Today's topic is not necessarily a directional way of talking about the impact of what we want to talk about today. Is the human aspect of everything that we feel. If you feel like that this topic is, if you feel distressed about this topic, there will be a link in the comment for you to reach out for help. I would like to continue by saying that when my family was going through, when I lost my mom, I saw my dad cried. I saw my dad cried and cried very heavily. I saw Roger Federer cried heavily when he lost in the finals of a tennis match. I saw different people express different emotions at certain time of their life. It's not necessarily of losing someone, but the loss and grief we're talking about is a loss of something that is valuable to you, something that is important to you at a certain time of your life. And the aspect that we want to delve into is whether it is a loss of a job, you get fired from work, it's a loss that a lot of people are grieving. And this week, actually, someone is telling me that he's struggling to focus on the work that he's doing now, because the work that he was fired from, he doesn't think he would ever get over that for the rest of his life. And this is a man talking to me with such an emotion that he attached to that job. The loss that we are talking about here, we'll touch on some of the statistics are out there already that we know more about. Today, the clear thing that we wanted to talk about is culture plays a very important role as to how we express our emotions. I was brought up in a family that you do what the boys are doing. I literally did everything the boys were doing, wherever they were going, I go with that. And so it's not very easy to show your emotions, but then at the same time, I was in touch with my emotions. As a matter of this, I want to come back to what Will said and what Petra also said. Culture has a very important role in playing with that. Petra, can you expand a little bit on what you meant when you said the way we approach that culture has something to? Can you expand a little bit on that, and then I'll come back to what Will was saying, and also if you want to touch on what Will just said as well, moving forward.
Yeah, well, I think that I don't know of obviously of all cultures and how things are, but certainly in Western culture, there has been a message that men are to be stoic, to be seen to be strong. And that's something that I've heard about from my husband and son as well. This sense that you don't get vulnerable because somebody is going to find a chink in your armor and it will be humiliating. You know, there isn't a sense of being supported as a man, from what I'm hearing in Western culture. If you show yourself as being what they call weak, it's not seen as something that is going to be getting support necessarily, but perhaps some kind of judgment about you. And I don't know whether that's true, because I've also seen that there have been certain influencers who've been very vulnerable, say on camera or whatever, and they've ended up getting massive responses. Wow, how wonderful that you could be so vulnerable and wear your heart on your sleeve like that. So I think it is valued, but I think that on the ground, it can be very difficult to do, because there is very much this sense of somebody's got to go first. So I think then we come back to, you know, that thing that Will said, you know, where if you're on the phone speaking to somebody and you can't be seen, there's no problem with really revealing just how hard it is, how painful it is. I'm sure that many men also will speak to women, as your client has to you, or to their spouses and so on. But I think for men to share amongst each other, that is where the difficulty is. That's what I meant by culture. You know, I think that it's a really sad thing, because everybody is a human being and everybody feels pain, and not to have a place to go where you feel that would be an acceptable thing to unpack is a very lonely experience. And that is also at the heart of grief, is this aloneness, that a thing has happened and you are really alone with the reality. No one can enter into that world of what it is like to have lost that. So yeah, I think when we've sort of normalized that women will talk about their feelings and weep and get comfort, and that men will be strong and not really reveal their feelings, then we put men at a serious disadvantage when it comes to having to deal with this very ubiquitous thing of loss and grief.
Okay. Will, did you want to add something? I want to say before you move on to whatever you want to add to this. In my culture, there's a saying that Bemanson. For some of you who don't know why, I'm from Africa, Ghana specifically, where we are told that in Akan they said Bemanson. It means that men don't cry. So when something happened to a man and he's sharing tears, it's a sign of weakness, indirect. Like, yeah, it's a sign of weakness. But at the same time, if you can't express it and you're keeping it within, also have an impact both positively and negatively, whereby societal aspect you're trying to impress or to show that Bemanson. But the fact is, if you cry, what happens? What happens when you cry? Will, excuse me to say, do you cry, and how often do you cry when you lose something or you are in grief? Do you cry? You are the first man we are having. How often do you cry?
How often do I cry? I cried a lot, actually. I mean, there are periods when I don't. But I was going to say, before I come back to that question, I was going to say it's really interesting over the last couple of months, let's say. I have noticed emotion being, you know, in terms of shedding of tears. Somebody could been quite surprised, actually, of emotion being shown by individuals, and sometimes there's support to somebody, you know, when I'm out and about. And from recollection, 90% or all of those instances of, you know, public emotion are women. I don't think I've seen a young man. I don't think it really matters what age you are, but I think it's that they have that. There's something about being out in the open, I guess. Small. I don't know, because there are people around. But yeah, I have always been a crier, if you like. I don't really, sometimes I do stifle my own emotions when in certain situations, social situations maybe. So you could say that I know that I want to cry, but I
So
don't.
would you say, or would you agree with the fact that Roger Federer was crying because he lost the final match to someone? Will that be an acceptable opinion that he's weak?
I think that you could certainly make that case personally in your own mind. I actually don't think now at this particular point it would be seen as unacceptable, but I think how you have internalized your understanding of maybe not even for men thinking about its grief, that for a lot of men it isn't acceptable. It goes back to, I think, it's certainly in the West, because that's where I've lived predominantly. It's just not, if I've been in leadership roles, I have for many decades, I've often thought about, should I show, is it acceptable for me to show my emotions at that particular moment? Because it almost feels like a self-indulgence. I'm there, but it's actually genderless. So that's a personal thing. That it's not appropriate sometimes. When I was on the phone as a telephone counselor, I would cry silently. But I didn't think it was appropriate. There were one or two instances where, it was congruent with the person that I was supporting. And we would both talk about it. But it's like invisible boundaries, social boundaries, which are internalized and
Talking about
can be quite damaging.
I do like what you've said there, Will, that there's a place for it. Sometimes, like if you're at work, you really would kind of decide, well, I'm not going to give myself permission, but when I'm with a friend or at home, I might do. And then, of course, there are those times when, you don't have any permission at all. It's just going to happen. I remember when Djokovic lost the tennis. I know you love to talk about tennis, Victoria. And
thank you very much.
Yeah, so he was just devastated that he had lost and so disappointed. And I don't know that we'd say that was grief, but anyway, the point is that he was expressing his emotion because he just didn't have an option. He didn't give himself permission. It was just going to happen. And, I don't think that it did him any harm. I think that for people to see that he really felt that badly about it was fine. And very often, if we can give ourselves permission to reveal that emotion, it normalizes it. It gives other people permission to step forward in their own humanity rather than have this facade of strength and, well, I'll just keep it all inside. I have gone to my therapist, who's a man, and wanted to cry and been damned if I would, because I don't want to reveal that emotion at this time. So I'm pinching myself on the soft part of my arm so it hurts. And then it takes my attention away from this overwhelming emotion. So I think we also do choose when we'll reveal that emotion and to whom. And it's maybe there's been a lot of influence, say, for men not to reveal those emotions, and I think they're getting more permission now to themselves, and generally culturally it's more acceptable to express emotions these days than it's ever been. So I think the permission and place has a big part to play as well.
Talking about, we are getting some comments from a number of people. We thank you all, those who are watching live from. We are coming to you live from Sydney, Australia. The time now is 11:51 in Sydney, Australia. We thank you so much for your time and watching with us. We are coming. I'm your host, Victoria Glover, and I have with me here Petra Page and Wilfred Roach. We are talking about the impact of loss and grief on humanity and who feels it more. We were looking at the individual aspect of when we lost something and how we express it, the emotions that we express, whether they are used for or against us, whether they strengthen us or they weaken us. We were talking about the societal pressures that comes along with expressing our emotions towards the losses that we encounter. I personally remember someone telling me someone lost the mother, and she said that she was crying and throwing herself on the ground. And the husband came in and said, when are you going to stop crying? Are you the only person who lost your mother? And she said, For 20 years, she's still holding on to that expression from the husband. Now, that is the individual aspect of how we deal with our emotions when we lost something. But at the same time, the societal expression of, well, the reason why the husband also, she said the husband said that was the fact that he wants her to stop the noise that she's making because the next door neighbors might hear that maybe she's doing something to her, that, or she's abusing her or anything, and that she should just shut up. At that moment, when we lose something, or we are crying, or we are looking for comfort, something hit us out of shock, all the emotions are going through. The people who are next to us, or the people who are around us, the expressions, their reactions towards how we grieve that loss, does that matter? Petra?
I'll pass it on to Will. He's got something to say, and I'll answer after.
All right, Will, you go.
Well, it's very interesting because I was born in Trinidad, and I'm Trinidadian, and it's a multiracial, it's a truly multiracial melting pot. Not without its drawbacks, but so you have half of the population who are descended from people from the Indian subcontinent, and I remember that how certain cultures deal with, or in that particular instance, that particular family deal with, somebody's impending passing, and the whole process in terms of ritual. And it was a woman that was next door, and I didn't really understand what was going on, which really showed where I'd come from in terms of where I'd spent most of my life, which was in London. So you don't hear and see the physical passing of somebody. And it was actually, I believe, if memory says, a long time ago, but it was a grandmother. And, I'm what we call a bit of a night owl. And I would sit out on the veranda at night, and it was cooler and quieter. And I just was aware of this person moaning and wasn't quite sure, didn't quite join all the dots together initially. And then I realized that she was actually passing. She was in her final phases, and she was on the veranda. The family had left her on the veranda. And then I saw the funeral, the car that removed her body, and it was a very interesting. It was a moment of connection as a human being with another human being who I didn't know, and how her family were there with her and part of the process of her passing. And it was beautiful and quite surprising to me how that process was managed, and how you were then invited to the house the next day or the same day to grieve with the family. And I had never had that experience, partly because had been removed from that cultural environment as a baby. But there it was. Everything was almost like a house collapsing. But in the West, it would be invisible. Yeah. But there it was.
I want to say that if you are watching this program and you are distressed about it, we'll put a link in the comment where you can seek help. You can call Lifeline or Beyond Blue, and all the other links will be in the link for you if you are feeling distressed about this. So I don't want us to dwell too much about the physical loss of another human being, which is just part of the loss. There are some other losses that we have that also are as heavy and impactful as the human loss. The passing of someone is the ultimate grief that we go through. And I know, as you all know, recently I lost 4 of my family members within 3 months. Within 3 months, I don't even know I will still be here talking about anything of that sort. I don't know where I got the strength from to even, there were days that I just can't function. the psychological impact of this sort of thing, the emotional toll that it has on individuals, combine that with that emotional impact on the family as a whole, in our relationship with our neighbors, the people that are immediately in front of us, be it your husband, your wife, your children, your neighbors, the cultural aspect of putting these things together in front of these people, is there a pressure on us to live within a certain area or scope of coping with these things, like we touched on before, the cultural aspect of dealing with them, and then the societal aspect of wherever you find yourself? Is there a difference between how we deal with these sort of things as an immigrant from our background, wherever we come from, and where we find ourselves now? How do we blend both? Petra, can you touch on what Will said a little bit more before you go into the next question? How do we kind of find a bridge between where we find ourselves and what we have to project for the society to see?
Well, I think just going back to what Will was saying, that's particular normalizing of loss and grief, whereas in our Western society, very often people don't have patience for their own discomfort. We have this sense of we're supposed to be happy, and if I'm not happy, then I've got to find the cause for that, and do something about it, not honor it as a legitimate feeling. And so, if somebody else is unhappy, sometimes they'll discover that people around them will subtly chastise them because they're engendering those feelings in them. They may even keep their distance, for their own mental health, and that leaves the sufferer very much on their own. There's also an idea in our society that the proper action of a friend and well-wisher is felt to be to distract the mourner from their grief rather than join them in it, which is so different to what the beautiful image that Will gave us of this family coming together and sharing their grief. So I think that that's a very difficult thing. Going back to what I said before about permission, do I have permission to be unhappy? Does it mean something about me? And am I alone in it, or is somebody going to join me? So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I do think that that is one of the great difficulties that we have is educating those people around us when we are in pain, that actually we need a kind of support rather than chastisement or distance, and be left to get on with it.
Excellent. Will, you touch on something very important about the picture that you just painted us in that scenario?
Mm.
What are we supposed to do if we are the neighbor, or we see a neighbor going through something like that? Where do we meet them? If someone is going through that, whether they tell you or you witness it, where do we meet them?
Well, it was interesting because I didn't.
How difficult can it be, depending on where we find ourselves? Sorry.
Well, it was interesting because I had never had that experience before. I mean, I had, culturally, or certainly I can speak within my own family, passing, dying was regularly discussed. It wasn't a thing that was seen as being, so in a way I'd already been prepped for it, but outside of the intensity of the environment that is that particular country. And it's not a subculture, but it's one of the cultures, one of the ways of dealing with impending loss.
So this is you're talking about the cultural that you come from, the Trinidad and Tobago.
One of them, yeah.
One of them. Okay. So in that culture, that's sometimes the way to go about it. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not something, it's public, it's accepted in a way that, interestingly, certainly in June, July, there were a number of sudden passings, and that was a very interesting way that was dealt with, and how I felt about it. And then there were, if you can use that word, expected passings, and how I dealt with it. It's a very complex dance, and maybe, I'm not the norm in terms of from, if you're looking at it from a gender perspective, I certainly wouldn't feel that I'm the norm in terms of men that I know and death or passing and grief. So in a way, I'm atypical. I'm not typical, because I have been exposed or found myself in situations where of either grief situations or impending grief. So I guess it's maybe given me a skill set to maneuver that helps me in terms of dealing with different forms of grief.
Can I say something here, Victoria? Just something that I noticed is that you've asked a question a few times over these podcasts, is what would you say a person is to do? And really, I think that the salient point is that you have to be. And, it's such an uncomfortable thing, because when we're doing, we feel empowered. And the thing about grief is it so disempowers us. Everything that we thought we were in control of has sort of fallen away, and something has happened to us, and we didn't have a say over it. And I think that, just kind of returning to this idea that we've been talking about is who feels it most, is, when my husband was diagnosed with cancer, and then when his company found out, they let him go because they didn't want him to die on their board. His reaction was, I will go out and I will do whatever I have to sort the situation out. He signed up to do his MBA, and he was out there talking to people and trying to make things happen. Whereas I didn't do. I just collapsed into feelings. And in fact, that was possibly a worse thing. It was more disempowering. It's much more empowering to kind of go out there and take action. And I think that really it could be this balance that we need to try to find. And in terms of grief, we've got this idea that there's a dual process of grief, where you attend to the grief, and then you attend to real life, and then you attend to grief, and you attend to real life. And that's a way of kind of restoring yourself, in a changed world, and also acknowledging the being that you're doing that has shifted so remarkably. So, I think that it is about giving yourself permission to be in the feelings, and to just be, and not have to do, but then at the same time to attend to your life and your other relationships and the things that are important, which brings you back to being re-empowered and connected. So I don't know if that's a helpful perspective to just shine on it.
Yeah, that's a helpful perspective. And in that aspect also, I want us to look at it also from a family part of way of looking at it through the lens of the family. Like the example that I just gave you, where the lady was saying that the husband commented that you're not the only person whose mother has died, and that you should just keep it within, shut up so you don't disturb the neighbors and all of that stuff. The impact of that sort of thing on the individual in the home, whereby she was saying that as a result of that, she just shut every door within her. She just shut everything. She was no more functioning at home. The impact of that on the children, and also on the husband. She was saying that because of, she doesn't want to bring it up to upset him again, so she kept everything. As a result of that, and the example you just gave us with your husband, be it the husband or the wife, this individual have to deal with himself first, then deal with the immediate family or whoever is within that scope of his life. And then also the relationships also come in, whereby your work also come in. How does the individual function when it comes to that? For example, when your husband's one was brought forward, how did you deal with it as a mother, as a wife, and as an individual? And also you have to go to work. Where do you go to find that strength to be able to cater for all of that?
Well, just in the example of the woman that you're talking about, I think that, you're feeling alone in your grief, and then you get disconnected from the one person, your partner, who really you'd hope would stand beside you and hold you up in this difficult time. But what was going on for him? This anxiety about the fact that some kind of weakness or commotion is being shown, that he might kind of end up with a label of having abused his wife because she's, wailing or whatever it is, and I think that it's very hard, to really bring compassion sometimes. Your own feelings might come up and you're all about, oh my gosh, this is my response, rather than how do I be generous with my response and hold the other person in compassion. So I think that in terms of my husband and I, it was also the beginning of a conversation, one that we hadn't had to have before. We hadn't contemplated the fact that one of us could die early, or that either of us would find ourselves, on the sidelines of our lives with no employment, So it is trying not to be judgmental about the situation. And I think that we do tend to judge the situation because in a way it's kind of, well, if we've made it wrong, then we can find a way of making it right. But actually, that's not how it works in grief. You can never make it right. You just have to learn to carry it. And it is being in that sort of that humility and that compassion for each other that you then meet each other and help each other. And, life begins to restore through that connection. What do you think, Will?
I was just going to say, Will, before you add to what Petra said, build it into it. So what Petra just said now, just touched also about the work and the environment. How do you build that into the work that you do, and then the kind of things that comes up at work in terms of dealing with this sort of thing? How would you add to what Petra just said, and then how would you weave that into the work environment for the individual and as a family person?
Is that for me or Petra?
That's for you. Yes, that's for you. Yes, Petra was asking what you want to add to what she just said.
Well, before I come to that point, I realized before that, I had parents that, in a way trained me, prepared me to deal with different forms of grief. And I saw them grapple with that. And that was a very useful thing. It was a very sometimes very confusing and also very confronting. But I didn't tell them that. But it was very useful when moving in different workspaces or unfamiliar spaces and being confronted with grief, to really learn. And I think it is a learned thing. It can be something if you could sort of figure out how to do it, but most people, I think, learn as they go along. You can learn professionally how to deal with things, but in terms of how to deal with your emotions, it was interesting how, as Petra said, it's being, but also accepting, and then walking. I call it walking alongside the person in the workspace, because I often, not frequently, but I said often, but was, in a managerial role, confronted with situations where somebody had a sudden loss, or confronted with a situation which somebody had not revealed to anybody. And it is in some ways surreal because you separate yourself. I had to separate myself from my own feelings, or put them to one side and be there for that person. And that's not an easy thing to do, whether it's in a workspace or personally.
Difficult.
Yeah, I think it is that business of the dual process of I'll attend to my grief, and I might do that at home, or I might have to just go into a breakout room at work, and then I'll be back and I'll be tending to life and my job and whatever else. And I think you have to remember that, we're people first. We're not automatons. We're not going to show up at work and be cogs in machines and somehow leave all that stuff behind. And I think that one of the roles of leaders in work is sometimes to normalize the fact that we might be having a difficult day. We may not be on form. And that's not an excuse, but it's kind of an acknowledgement. And then let's attend back to what needs to be attended to, whether that's on the emotional or the other side. And I think that people come back quicker when they feel seen and heard and understood, rather than when they suppress it and they're very alone with it. It takes a much longer time then, to digest that grief, because grief is a process of digesting the indigestible. And, when it's done on your own, and in secret and so on, well, it can actually become indigestible. Whereas when it's done in a supportive environment, there's a lot to do on your own. But at the same time, other people realize what you're going through and can be very compassionate with that. It can be much easier to metabolize it.
Excellent. Before we wrap up, I want to say that if you are watching us live, we are talking about the impact of loss and grief on humanity and who feels it more. And we are talking about that impact in the work environment. We just touch on that as well. As a society, we touch a little bit on the impact it has on the individual and the family and even the neighbor. And so the impact of grief and loss on work and productivity in the workplace can be a massive thing. So someone whose work who work at a certain level, all of a sudden the productivity level has dropped, or the person is not functioning anymore because there's something else going on. It's up to the individual who is the leader or the manager or the whoever to be able to absorb that. But sometimes we don't have the courage to talk about these things to our managers or our employers and all of that. We try to deal with it individually, or sometimes just zip it up and not bring it up as a result. So our time is actually running up. So I would like us to talk a little bit about what we took out from today's topic, so that next week, God willing, we will expand on this particular area, the impact of loss and grief on productivity in the workplace and how we can go about solving that. So I want us to go through, what did you take from today's topic, the impact of loss on the individual from a human perspective? I forgot to mention, someone did mention to me the other day when I put the poll out that she will actually not, she's not actually comfortable with us talking about it from a gender perspective. As a result, that is where culture comes in, because every culture deals with gender differently in a way that they deal with different situations. And so this person wasn't comfortable for us talking about it through the eyes of a man and a woman. And she would have loved that we don't bring the sexism into it. But can we actually talk about loss and grief without actually looking at it from that breakdown? Is that possible? Petra, would you like to shine some light on that for us briefly?
Look, I'm not a man, and yet I have been told by many men that they're not comfortable expressing their emotions. I don't know if that's a man thing or if it's a culture thing, but I do think it needs acknowledging. I don't think it should be delegitimized. Oh, well, gender, let's just get rid of that. It is a real burden for men, and we know that from the suicide figures, that they are actually struggling alone and don't feel that they can unpack it. And I think with the greatest of compassion, that's something that needs to be given some air and acknowledged. And yeah, we talked about permission earlier. So, just to sort of, in terms of summary, everybody needs to give themselves permission to grieve, and not to pack it away, not decide to, I suppose, not live into it in that moment. I think they also need to give everybody around them permission to grieve if that's where they are, and be compassionate in it, rather than be putting their own discomfort with grief ahead of things. And I think just for the self, it's important to give yourself permission to tell somebody that it's really painful and you're struggling. I mean, if you're one of those rare few who can carry it without needing to share it with somebody, then that's who you are. But I would say that in general, we do so much better when we share our pain with people who love us and with whom we're connected. It just makes the whole process much easier to carry in the end, if those people can be compassionate about it rather than uncomfortable.
Wow. We'll, before I hear the summary of what you pick up from today's meeting, last week you did mention something very important. You said that acceptance is very crucial when we are dealing with a loss and grieving about it. We need to accept that it has happened and that we can do something about it. And today, Petra is also talking about permission. We need to give ourselves permission to be able to grieve that this is what is going on. Looking at acceptance and permission and summary of what you have taken out today, what would your summary be? What would you say?
I mean, well, in a minute, I think it's a very challenging dance, and maybe the starting point is self-acceptance rather than looking wider afield, and seeing where that particular walk takes you. You know, the walk within, as opposed to looking without and what the sort of cultural norms or expectations or however you wish to put it are on you. You know, do that inward walking and see where it takes you.
I love that. That's beautiful, Will.
Inward walking and see how that takes you. That's a journey. And on that journey, I want us to meet acceptance and meet permission. And to put the two of you together, what you have just summarized, I want to say that to take that journey, also we have to start the conversation about the fact that some of us we are in shock when it does happen, for the fact that we haven't talked about it. So it's very heavy to handle. But if we build that into everyday conversation, which we are doing now, we are trying to see if we can normalize loss and grief in our everyday conversation, which was the topic we dealt with last week. And so today I would like to say that for me personally, what I might take out is that if we are seeking acceptance of what has happened, which I have to deal with myself, and to give myself permission to grieve as much as possible, I also say that it will be important if we can start the conversation with ourselves first, and then see if we can try and start that conversation with others, so that when we find ourselves in that situation, even though we are expecting, we will be able to handle it a little bit more, even though it doesn't make it anything less. I would like to thank everybody who has been watching us today with us live, all the way from Sydney or wherever you are watching from. We just want to thank you for watching this topic. It hasn't been easy. We are trying to normalize it as much as we can. We try to put it on the back burner, but unfortunately it has come up again, and we wanted to hear your comments and your additions and your ideas and all that you can add to everything else we have talked about today. It doesn't end here. The conversation goes on. So we want to hear from you what you have taken out from today's discussion in the comment sections. And we want to thank you all for coming. And once again, we want to give it up for Petra Page and Wilfred Road. Thank you so much for coming once again. God bless you. We look forward to seeing you next week at the same time. Thank you. And thank you.
Thank you.
And Wilfred.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye now.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.